The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street as Perla Martinez unlocked the door to her bicycle shop. The familiar routine had become a ritual over the past 5 years. Turn the key, flip the sign from closed to open, and begin another day of simple repairs in the quiet town of Cedar Falls. But this morning felt different somehow, though she couldn't quite explain why. The small bell above the door chimed softly as she entered, triggering memories of her first day in this building. She remembered how empty it had been then. Just four walls, concrete floors, and the lingering smell of the auto parts store that had occupied the space before her. Now it was filled with the organized chaos of a working bicycle shop, wheels hanging from ceiling hooks, tool benches cluttered with wrenches and cables, and the comfortable disorder of a place where things got fixed rather than just sold. Perla walked to her main workbench where yesterday's projects waited. A child's mountain bike with a bent derailleur, an elderly woman's cruiser with a seized brake cable, and a racing bike belonging to one of the high school students who worked part-time at the grocery store. Simple problems with straightforward solutions. Nothing like the complex geological formations that had once consumed her professional life. She had been Perla Martinez, geological engineer, for 12 years before becoming Perla Martinez, bicycle mechanic. The transition hadn't been gradual or planned. It had been abrupt and necessary, driven by a single day that had changed everything she thought she knew about rocks and earth and the stability of the ground beneath people's feet. But that was 15 years ago now, and she had learned to live with the weight of that day. Most mornings, she could focus on brake cables and chain links without thinking about mining shafts and geological surveys. Most mornings, the past stayed buried where it belonged. This morning was different, though she didn't yet know why. The first customer arrived at 8:30 sharp. Mrs. Patterson wheeled in her grandson's bicycle, the front wheel wobbling dangerously with every rotation. "Tommy hit a pothole on Elm Street," she explained, slightly out of breath from the walk. "The wheel started doing this shimmy thing, and now he can't ride it at all." Perla examined the wheel, spinning it slowly and watching the side-to-side movement. 3 spokes were loose, and the rim had been knocked slightly out of true. A classic pothole injury, easily repaired but requiring patience and precision. "I can have this fixed by this afternoon," she said, beginning to loosen the affected spokes. "But Mrs. Patterson, Tommy really should be wearing a helmet when he rides. This could have been a head injury instead of just a wheel problem." Mrs. Patterson nodded, though Perla suspected the helmet conversation would be forgotten by the time Tommy got his bike back. People often focused on fixing the immediate problem without addressing the underlying safety issues. It was human nature, and Perla had learned not to take it personally when her safety recommendations were ignored. She had learned that lesson the hard way. As Mrs. Patterson left, promising to return after lunch, Perla settled into the meditative rhythm of wheel truing. It was precise work that required constant attention. Adjust the spoke tension, spin the wheel, check for wobble, adjust again. The process couldn't be rushed, and mistakes were immediately visible. Unlike some forms of engineering, bicycle repair offered immediate feedback and clear results. She was concentrating on a particularly stubborn spoke when the bell chimed again. This time, a young boy entered, his face streaked with tears and dirt from a fallen bike. The sight stopped Perla mid-adjustment, bringing back memories of another child, another bicycle, another day when simple repairs had seemed like the most important work in the world. "What happened here?" she asked gently, setting down her spoke wrench and kneeling to the boy's level. "I crashed into the fence near Miller's farm," the boy sniffled, wheeling his bike forward so she could see the damage. "My mom's going to be so mad. This was my birthday present." The bike was a mess. The front wheel was bent beyond simple truing, the handlebars were twisted, and the chain had come off the gears entirely. But Perla had seen worse, and she knew that what looked like disaster to a 9-year-old was actually just another Tuesday morning repair job. "Let's see what we can do about that," she said, lifting the bike onto her main workstand. Her hands moved with practiced precision, straightening the handlebars first, then working on the wheel. The boy watched in fascination as she dismantled the front brake assembly, heated and straightened the rim, and replaced several damaged spokes. It was more extensive work than a typical repair, but she found herself taking extra care with each step. There was something about working on children's bicycles that always made her more thorough. Maybe it was because kids were more vulnerable to mechanical failures, or maybe it was because a broken bike represented such a significant loss in a child's world. Either way, she never cut corners when fixing a bike that would carry someone's child. "How much do I owe you?" the boy asked when she finished, pulling crumpled dollar bills from his pocket with the seriousness of someone conducting important business. "Tell you what," Perla said, wiping her hands on an old rag. "Next time you see someone who needs help, you help them. That's payment enough." The boy grinned and pedaled away, testing his repaired bike with the joy of someone who had received an unexpected gift. Perla watched him go, then returned to her workbench. This was her life now. Simple repairs, quiet conversations, small acts of kindness. It was peaceful. It was safe. It was everything her old life had not been. The morning continued with its familiar rhythm. A college student brought in a road bike with shifting problems. A middle-aged man needed new tires for his commuter bicycle. An elderly woman asked Perla to adjust the seat height on her three-wheeler so she could reach the ground more easily. Each repair was a small puzzle to solve, a problem with clear parameters and achievable solutions. Perla found comfort in the predictability of mechanical systems. Cables stretched over time, chains wore out, brake pads needed replacement. These were problems that could be anticipated, prevented, or fixed with the right tools and sufficient knowledge. It was so different from her previous career, where the problems were buried deep underground, and the consequences of being wrong could be measured in human lives. But she didn't let herself think about that. Not anymore. Not usually. Around 10:30, she noticed a group of teenagers gathering near the shop. There were 5 of them, ranging in age from maybe 15 to 18. She recognized most of them from around town, though she didn't know their names. Cedar Falls was small enough that faces became familiar even without formal introductions. They were dressed for adventure. Hiking boots, backpacks, water bottles clipped to their belts. One of them was examining something on his phone, while the others clustered around, pointing toward the hills north of town, and talking in the excited tones of young people planning something they probably shouldn't do. Perla tried to focus on the brake adjustment she was making, but something about their energy made her uneasy. She had seen that look before, on the faces of young miners eager to explore new sections of the underground, the mixture of thrill and confidence that often preceded trouble. She told herself it was none of her business. These weren't her children. This wasn't her responsibility. She had learned to mind her own business, to focus on the work in front of her, to avoid getting involved in situations that might remind her of the day when her professional judgment had failed so catastrophically. But as the group passed by the shop window, she caught fragments of their conversation. "You sure about this?" one of them asked. "Come on, don't be scared," another replied. "It's just a cave. People have been exploring it for years." Cave. The word hit Perla like a physical blow, triggering memories she had worked hard to suppress. Underground spaces, rock formations, the weight of earth and stone pressing down from above, the sound of creaking timber supports, and the smell of mineral-rich air. She set down her tools and looked up, watching the teenagers head toward the trail that led to the northern hills. Her chest tightened with a familiar anxiety she hadn't felt in years, the same feeling that used to wake her up in the middle of the night during her first year in Cedar Falls. Cedar Falls had several natural caves in the surrounding hills. Most were shallow formations, barely deep enough to qualify as caverns. Local hikers sometimes explored the larger ones, though Perla had heard rumors that some of the cave systems were unstable and potentially dangerous. She tried to return to her work, but her hands were shaking slightly. The brake cable kept slipping out of the adjustment mechanism, and she realized she wasn't concentrating properly. Her mind kept drifting to the group of teenagers, imagining them descending into darkness, trusting in rock formations they didn't understand, assuming that just because other people had explored the caves before, they would be safe. The rational part of her mind insisted that she was overreacting. Thousands of people explored natural caves every year without incident. The teenagers were probably just planning to look around the entrance area, take some photos, and come back with a story to tell their friends. They would be fine. But the part of her mind that remembered the Blackstone mine disaster wasn't convinced. That part remembered how quickly stable-looking rock formations could become deadly traps. That part remembered the sound of a mine shaft collapsing, the screams of people trapped underground, and the terrible silence that followed. Perla had been the lead geological engineer for Blackstone Mining Company for 8 years before the accident. She had started there straight out of graduate school, eager to apply her knowledge of rock mechanics and geological formations to the practical work of mining operations. She had loved the intellectual challenge of reading the Earth's structure, of understanding how pressure and time had shaped the underground spaces where men worked every day. Her job was to assess the stability of mining tunnels, to identify potential hazards before they became actual dangers, to ensure that the company's extraction operations were conducted safely. She took pride in her thoroughness, her attention to detail, her reputation for conservative safety recommendations. She had worked with the same crew for years, developing professional relationships that gradually became personal friendships. Tommy Rodriguez was the crew chief, a man 10 years her senior who had been mining since he was 18. Sarah Chen was the explosives specialist, brilliant with chemistry and timing, always joking that she got paid to blow things up legally. Mike O'Sullivan ran the heavy machinery, operating the massive diggers and haulers with the skill of an artist. Janet Pike was the safety coordinator, responsible for emergency procedures and evacuation protocols. They trusted her geological assessments. When she said a section was safe to work, they worked there. When she recommended additional support structures, they installed them. When she suggested avoiding certain areas due to unstable rock formations, they found other places to dig. For 8 years, that system worked perfectly. Perla's surveys were accurate, the crew's safety record was exemplary, and Blackstone's mining operations were both profitable and secure. She began to believe that she had mastered the art of reading underground geology, that her understanding of rock mechanics was sophisticated enough to predict and prevent any potential disaster. That confidence proved to be her greatest mistake. The new section was deep in the mine's eastern expansion, an area rich with high-grade ore, deposits that promised significant profits for the company. Perla had surveyed the region extensively, taking core samples, measuring pressure differentials, and analyzing the structural integrity of the surrounding rock formations. Her reports indicated that the area was geologically stable, suitable for standard mining operations with routine safety precautions. The rock was primarily granite and limestone, formations she understood well from years of experience. The structural analysis showed no unusual stress patterns or instability indicators. Everything looked normal. She had been wrong. The explosion happened on a Tuesday morning in October, 15 years ago. Perla was in the surface laboratory, analyzing mineral samples from the previous day's extraction, when the ground began to shake. At first, She thought it was just blasting from another section of the mine, but the vibrations were too intense and lasted too long. Then the alarms started screaming. The mine's emergency communication system crackled to life with reports of a collapse in the eastern section. Section 7, where Tommy and Sarah and Mike and Janet were working. Section 7, which Perla had certified as safe just 3 weeks earlier. The explosion had been caused by a natural gas pocket that her surveys had failed to detect. The gas had accumulated in a small cavern within the limestone formation, invisible to her testing equipment and undetectable by the methods she had used. When the crew's excavation work breached the cavern wall, the escaping gas had mixed with dust and oxygen in the tunnel, creating an explosive mixture that ignited from a spark off the metal digging equipment. The explosion caused a catastrophic collapse of the entire section. 27 miners were working below ground that day. 23 made it to the emergency evacuation routes and were brought safely to the surface. 4 didn't make it out. Tommy Rodriguez, Sarah Chen, Mike O'Sullivan, and Janet Pike were trapped when the ceiling came down. Rescue crews worked for 18 hours to reach them, but the secondary collapses had made the tunnels too unstable to navigate safely. The 4 bodies were never recovered. The official investigation took 6 months and concluded that the disaster had been caused by an undetectable natural gas accumulation in an unmapped geological formation. The report cleared Perla of professional negligence, noting that her survey methods had been consistent with industry standards and that the gas pocket would have been impossible to identify with existing technology. But official clearance didn't erase the weight of knowing that 4 people had died because she had missed something in her geological analysis. 4 people who had trusted her expertise, who had relied on her professional judgment, who had gone to work that morning, believing they would be coming home that evening. The families of the deceased received compensation from the mining company. The mine was permanently sealed. New safety protocols were implemented industry-wide to prevent similar accidents. Life moved on, but Perla couldn't move on. Every night, she saw their faces in her dreams. Every morning, she woke up remembering their voices, their jokes, their stories about their families and their plans for the future. The weight of their absence pressed down on her like the tons of rock that had crushed them underground. She tried to return to work, but every geological survey reminded her of the one she had gotten wrong. Every safety assessment carried the fear that she might miss another critical detail, might overlook another hidden danger that could cost more lives. She found herself second-guessing every decision, paralyzed by the possibility that her professional judgment was fundamentally flawed. 6 months after the accident, she submitted her resignation to Blackstone Mining Company. She sold her house, liquidated her savings, bought a pickup truck, and began driving without a specific destination in mind. She just knew she needed to get as far away as possible from underground spaces and geological formations and the kind of work where other people's lives depended on her ability to read the language of rocks and earth. She drove for 3 weeks before finding Cedar Falls. It was a small town surrounded by rolling hills and open sky, a place where the deepest hole was probably the foundation of the bank building. No mines, no tunnels, no underground workspaces where people could disappear forever. It felt safe in a way that underground spaces never could. The bicycle shop had been for sale for months, its previous owner having retired to Florida. The price was reasonable, and the work was simple. Fix chains, adjust brakes, replace worn tires, mechanical problems with visible solutions and predictable outcomes. Nothing like the complex geological systems that had betrayed her before. She bought the shop and the small apartment above it, using most of her remaining savings. The transition from geological engineer to bicycle mechanic was jarring, but she found comfort in the simplicity of the work. Bicycles didn't hide dangerous secrets in their mechanical systems. When something was wrong, you could see it, diagnose it, and fix it with the right tools and techniques. The people of Cedar Falls accepted her presence without asking too many questions about her past. Small towns were accustomed to people arriving with histories they didn't want to discuss. As long as she provided good service and participated reasonably in community life, her origins were her own business. She developed a reputation for thorough, careful repairs. She never rushed a job, never took shortcuts that might compromise safety, never dismissed a customer's concerns as unimportant. If a bicycle needed new parts, she ordered them rather than using salvaged components that might fail. If a repair looked risky, she recommended replacement rather than attempting a quick fix that could lead to accidents. Some customers found her overly cautious, but most appreciated her attention to detail. Parents brought their children's bicycles to her shop because they knew the work would be done properly. Serious cyclists trusted her with expensive racing bikes because they knew she understood the importance of precision and reliability. Over the years, Perla had built a quiet, stable life in Cedar Falls. She read occasionally, mystery novels mostly, nothing related to geology or engineering. She volunteered at the library on Sunday afternoons, helping elderly patrons with computer questions. She attended town council meetings, though she rarely spoke up. She helped neighbors with various small projects, always offering practical assistance rather than advice or opinions. She was present in the community, but not prominent, helpful, but not heroic. She had learned to live with the weight of her past without being crushed by it, to find purpose in simple work without needing recognition or validation. That equilibrium had sustained her for 5 years. Until this morning, when 5 teenagers had walked past her shop on their way to explore a cave system, and all the fears she had buried came rushing back to the surface. She tried to focus on her work, but her hands kept trembling. The brake adjustment she was making required steady precision, but she couldn't seem to hold the tools properly. Her mind kept racing through worst-case scenarios, imagining the teenagers encountering unstable rock formations, getting trapped underground, experiencing the kind of disaster she had failed to prevent 15 years ago. The rational part of her mind insisted she was being paranoid. Natural caves were different from mining tunnels. The teenagers were probably just planning a brief exploration of the entrance area. Even if they went deeper into the cave system, they would likely encounter other hikers or obvious warning signs if there were serious dangers. But the part of her mind that remembered the Blackstone disaster wasn't convinced by rational arguments. That part remembered how quickly stable situations could become deadly, how easily experienced professionals could misread geological warning signs, how the earth could betray even the most careful and knowledgeable people. By 11 o'clock, she couldn't concentrate on her work at all. She set down her tools and walked to the front window, staring up at the trail that led toward the northern hills. The teenagers had disappeared from view, presumably making their way toward whatever cave system had caught their interest. She told herself to mind her own business. These weren't her children, and this wasn't her responsibility. She had left the world of geological hazards behind when she became a bicycle mechanic. She didn't owe anyone her expertise or her intervention. But as she stood at the window, she kept thinking about Tommy Rodriguez and Sarah Chen and Mike O'Sullivan and Janet Pike. She remembered how they had trusted her professional judgment, how they had relied on her geological surveys to keep them safe underground. She remembered how that trust had been misplaced, how her failure to detect the gas pocket had led to their deaths. She also remembered the promise she had made to herself in the months after the accident. Never again would she allow her knowledge of geological hazards to go unused when people might be in danger. Never again would she hide behind professional caution or personal fear when her expertise might save lives. It was a promise she had found easy to keep in Cedar Falls, where there were no mines or tunnels or underground hazards to worry about. But now, for the first time in 5 years, she was facing a situation where her geological knowledge might be relevant, where her understanding of rock formations and structural stability might mean the difference between safety and disaster for 5 young people. The question was whether she had the courage to act on that knowledge, despite the risk that she might be wrong again. At 11:15, Mrs. Chen arrived to pick up her daughter's repaired bicycle. Perla packaged up the bike and attempted to make normal conversation about the weather and the upcoming school year, but her distraction was obvious. "You seem worried about something today," Mrs. Chen observed as she loaded the bicycle into her car. "Just concerned about some kids who went hiking," Perla replied without thinking. "Oh, you mean Jake Morrison and his friends?" "Yes, Lisa's mother called me this morning. They're exploring that cave system up north. Boys will be boys, I suppose, though mothers always worry." The casual mention of the cave system sent a chill through Perla. If the parents knew about the expedition and weren't concerned, maybe she was overreacting. Maybe the caves were well known and safe, regularly explored by local hikers without incident. Or maybe the parents didn't understand the potential dangers any better than the teenagers did. After Mrs. Chen left, Perla tried to return to her work, but she found herself checking the clock every few minutes. If the teenagers had reached the cave around noon, they would probably spend an hour or two exploring before heading back. They should be visible on the return trail by mid-afternoon, unless something went wrong, unless the cave system was less stable than they expected, unless they encountered the kind of hidden geological hazard that her surveys had missed at the Blackstone mine. By noon, she couldn't stand the uncertainty anymore. She locked the bicycle shop and walked to the town library, where she could access geological survey databases and research the cave system the teenagers were exploring. The Cedar Falls Public Library was a small building with limited resources, but it had computer access to state geological records. Perla hadn't accessed these databases in 5 years, but her professional credentials were still active. Within minutes, she was reviewing topographical surveys and geological assessments of the northern hills. What she found made her stomach sink. The cave system was more extensive and more dangerous than local rumors suggested. The main entrance led to a large chamber, but that chamber connected to a network of smaller passages that extended deep into the hillside. The geological survey noted that the caves had been formed by water erosion in limestone bedrock, creating inherently unstable formations that were subject to sudden collapse. More concerning was a recent addendum to the survey, dated just 8 months ago. Recent seismic activity has increased fracture formation in the upper chambers. Structural integrity appears compromised. Recommend professional evaluation and possible closure to recreational access. The recommendation had apparently been ignored. There were no posted warnings about the cave system, no barriers preventing access, no indication that local authorities had taken any action based on the geological assessment. 5 teenagers were exploring a cave system that had been officially identified as structurally compromised and potentially dangerous. They were walking into a situation that could collapse without warning, trapping them underground with no hope of rescue. Perla stared at the computer screen, her hands shaking as she absorbed the implications of what she was reading. This wasn't paranoia or excessive caution. This was a real and immediate danger that the teenagers couldn't recognize because they lacked the geological knowledge to interpret the warning signs. She was the only person who knew about the danger and had the expertise to assess its significance. She was the only one who could act on this information before it was too late. But acting meant returning to the world of geological hazards she had tried so hard to leave behind. It meant trusting her professional judgment again, despite the knowledge that she had been catastrophically wrong before. It meant risking the possibility that she might fail again, that more people might die because she had misread the geological evidence. The safe choice was to call the sheriff's office and let them handle the situation. Professional emergency responders had training and equipment for cave rescues. They could reach the teenagers more safely than she could, and they weren't carrying the psychological baggage of a previous disaster. But the sheriff's office was 15 minutes away, and it would take time to organize a rescue response. The deputies might not understand the urgency of the geological warnings. They might treat it as a routine missing persons case, rather than a race against time to reach the teenagers before the cave system collapsed. Every minute of delay increased the risk that the teenagers would penetrate deeper into the unstable cave system, moving further from the exit and closer to the sections most likely to collapse. Perla looked at the clock on the library computer. 12:20. If the teenagers had reached the cave on schedule, they had been inside for 20 minutes already. They were probably past the entrance chamber by now, exploring the connecting passages that the geological survey had identified as most dangerous. She closed the database and grabbed her truck keys. She wasn't sure what she would do when she reached the cave, but she couldn't sit in the library reading geological surveys while 5 young people risked their lives underground. Not again. Not when she had the knowledge and expertise that might save them. The drive to the northern hills took 18 minutes on the winding county road that connected Cedar Falls to the surrounding countryside. Perla's truck handled the narrow curves easily, but her heart was racing with anxiety and adrenaline she hadn't felt since her mining days. She parked at the unofficial trailhead where other hikers had left their vehicles over the years. The trail to the cave system was well marked by foot traffic, though there were no official signs or guideposts. She grabbed a flashlight from her emergency kit and checked her cell phone for signal strength. No bars. She was on her own. The hike to the cave entrance took another 15 minutes, most of it uphill through pine forest and rocky outcroppings. Perla's legs remembered the rhythm of walking on uneven terrain, though she was more winded than she had expected. 5 years of bicycle repair work hadn't maintained the physical fitness she had developed during her mining career. The cave entrance was larger than she had expected based on the geological survey photos. A roughly oval opening about 10 feet wide and 8 feet high, leading into darkness beyond the reach of daylight. 5 backpacks were stacked neatly beside the entrance, confirming that the teenagers were inside. Perla called out toward the cave mouth, "Hello? Jake? Lisa?" Her voice echoed back from the depths, but there was no response. Either the teenagers were too deep inside to hear her, or they were unable to respond. Both possibilities frightened her. She examined the cave entrance more carefully, using her geological training to assess the stability of the surrounding rock formations. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. The limestone ceiling above the entrance was riddled with stress fractures, some of them wide enough to fit her fingers into. Fresh fractures, the kind that developed when underground pressure was building toward a collapse. These were the same warning signs she should have recognized at the Blackstone mine, the kind of geological indicators that preceded catastrophic structural failures. The cave system was actively deteriorating, and the teenagers inside were in immediate danger. She pulled out her cell phone again, hoping to find enough signal to call for help, but the screen showed no service. The nearest landline was back in town, and even if she drove back immediately, it would take at least an hour to organize a professional rescue response. By then, the cave might have already collapsed. The smart thing to do was to go back to town and call for help, trusting that professional rescuers would be able to reach the teenagers before disaster struck. The safe thing to do was to stay out of the cave herself and avoid the possibility of becoming another victim who needed rescue. But Perla had learned the hard way that sometimes the smart thing and the safe thing weren't the right thing. Sometimes knowledge came with responsibilities that couldn't be delegated to other people. Sometimes expertise demanded action, even when that action involved personal risk. She had failed 4 people 15 years ago because she hadn't recognized the geological warning signs in time. She couldn't fail 5 more people today because she was afraid to trust her own judgment. Perla checked her flashlight battery and stepped into the cave. The temperature dropped immediately as she moved away from the entrance, and the quality of light changed from bright sunlight to the gray dimness of reflected illumination. The cave smelled of minerals and moisture, familiar scents that brought back memories of her mining days. Her flashlight beam revealed a spacious entrance chamber that extended back into the hillside for maybe 50 feet. The ceiling was higher than she had expected, rising to 15 or 20 feet in some places. Several smaller passages branched off from the main chamber, leading deeper into the cave system. She could hear voices echoing from somewhere in the depths, young voices engaged in animated conversation. They sounded excited and happy, unaware of the geological hazards surrounding them. The sound came from a passage that angled downward and to the right, away from the main chamber. Perla followed the voices, moving carefully over the uneven limestone floor. Her engineer's eye automatically cataloged the geological features around her. Water stains indicating seasonal flooding, loose rocks from previous minor collapses, hairline cracks in the walls and ceiling that were definitely wider than they should be in a stable formation. Everything about this cave system screamed danger to someone with her training and experience. The teenagers probably couldn't recognize the warning signs, but to Perla, they were as obvious as flashing emergency lights. The passage she was following curved and descended for about 70 feet before opening into a second chamber. This one was smaller and more irregular than the entrance area, with a ceiling that hung low in several places and walls that showed clear evidence of recent geological stress. She could hear the teenagers more clearly now, their voices echoing from yet another passage on the far side of the chamber. They were deeper in the cave system than she had hoped, further from the exit and closer to the areas most likely to experience structural collapse. "This is incredible," she heard one of them say. "Look at all these formations," added another voice. They sounded fascinated and completely relaxed, like tourists visiting a safe and well-maintained attraction. They had no idea they were exploring a geological death trap that could collapse at any moment. Perla moved across the second chamber as quickly as she dared, following the sound of their voices. The connecting passage was narrower than the previous one and curved sharply to the left. She had to duck in several places to avoid striking her head on rock projections. After another 100 feet, the passage opened into a third chamber, where her flashlight beam finally located the 5 teenagers. They were clustered around a flowstone formation near the back wall, taking pictures with their cell phones and discussing the geological processes that had created the mineral deposits. One of them had a small LED lantern that provided enough light for them to see their immediate surroundings, but not enough to reveal the condition of the ceiling above their heads. If they could have seen the ceiling clearly, they would have been running for the exit. The entire upper surface of the chamber was a network of cracks and fissures, some of them large enough to indicate imminent structural failure. Several sections had already partially separated from the main rock face and were being held in place by increasingly thin connections that could break at any moment. It looked like a disaster waiting to happen. Perla had seen similar formations in the days leading up to the Blackstone mine collapse, and she knew what they meant. This chamber was going to come down, and when it did, anyone inside would be crushed or trapped with no possibility of escape. "Hey," she called out, trying to keep her voice calm and controlled. "You kids need to come with me right now." The teenagers turned in surprise, their phone cameras flashing in her direction as they tried to identify the unexpected visitor. "Who are you?" asked a tall boy who looked like he might be the leader of the group. "My name is Perla Martinez. I own the bicycle shop in town. I need you to trust me and follow me out of here immediately. This cave is extremely dangerous and could collapse at any time." "What do you mean, dangerous?" the boy asked, looking around the chamber. "It's just a cave. People explore it all the time." "Look up," Perla said, pointing her flashlight toward the ceiling. The teenagers followed her light beam, and several of them gasped audibly. Even without geological training, they could see that the rocks above their heads were hanging by increasingly fragile connections. The ceiling looked like a giant jigsaw puzzle that was ready to fall apart. "Oh my God," whispered a girl with long dark hair. "Is it going to fall?" asked one of the younger boys. "I don't know exactly when," Perla said honestly, "but it's definitely going to fall. We need to get out of here right now. Follow me, stay close together, and try not to make any sudden movements or loud noises that might trigger a collapse." The teenagers gathered their belongings quickly and formed a line behind Perla. She led them back through the narrow, connecting passage, moving as fast as she dared, while still being careful not to disturb the unstable rock formations around them. They were halfway across the second chamber when they heard the first ominous rumble. It started as a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the rock itself, a sound felt as much as heard. Then it grew into a grinding, crackling noise that echoed through the cave system. Dust began falling from the ceiling, and several of the teenagers started to panic. "Stay calm," Perla said firmly, though her own heart was racing. "Keep moving, but don't run. Running will only make the vibrations worse." But even as she spoke, she could feel the structural failure beginning. The cave system was starting to collapse from the deepest chambers outward, creating a progressive failure that would eventually reach the entrance. They had minutes, maybe less, before the passages they needed to use would be blocked by fallen rock. "Move faster," she amended, abandoning her earlier caution. "But stay together and follow my lead." They hurried through the second chamber just as chunks of limestone began falling behind them. The passage they had just exited was now partially blocked by debris, and more rocks were falling every second. If they had been even a minute slower, they would have been trapped in the deeper sections of the cave with no escape route. The rumbling was getting louder and more frequent now. Perla could feel the ground shaking beneath her feet as successive sections of the cave system collapsed in sequence. The structural failure was spreading through the limestone formation like dominoes falling, each collapse destabilizing the next section and creating an irreversible chain reaction. They reached the main entrance chamber to find that rocks were already falling from the ceiling near the cave mouth. The exit was still passable, but it was clear that the entrance itself would soon be sealed by the collapse. "Run!" Perla said urgently. "Run for the entrance as fast as you can. Don't look back. Don't hesitate. Just get outside." The teenagers sprinted across the chamber as limestone chunks crashed down around them. Perla brought up the rear, her flashlight beam dancing wildly as she dodged falling debris and tried to keep track of all 5 young people ahead of her. A rock the size of a basketball smashed into the ground inches from her left foot, sending fragments of stone ricocheting in all directions. Another chunk, this one the size of a watermelon, grazed her shoulder and tore her shirt, though it didn't break the skin. The noise was deafening now, a continuous roar of falling rock and grinding stone that made communication impossible. The air was thick with limestone dust that stung their eyes and throats. The entire cave system was coming apart around them. Jake Morrison, the tall boy who had been leading the group, reached the entrance first and dove out into the bright afternoon sunlight. Lisa Park was right behind him. Then Kevin Walsh and the 2 younger teenagers whose names Perla still didn't know. Perla was still 15 feet from the exit when she heard the loudest crack yet. a sound like a massive tree trunk snapping, but amplified 100-fold. She looked up to see a section of the ceiling the size of a small car breaking away from its supports. It was falling directly toward the entrance passage, and she realized with crystal clarity that it would seal the cave permanently and crush anyone who happened to be underneath it. There was no time to think, only time to act. Perla threw herself forward in a desperate dive, rolling across the rocky floor as the massive limestone slab crashed down behind her. She felt the ground shake with the impact and heard the thunderous echo as tons of rock sealed the cave entrance forever. When the dust settled and the rumbling stopped, she found herself lying in bright sunlight just outside what had been the cave mouth. Her clothes were torn, her hands were scraped, and her left shoulder ached from where the falling rock had grazed it. But she was alive and uninjured. The 5 teenagers were clustered around her, all talking at once in voices that mixed relief with shock and gratitude. "Are you okay?" "That was insane! You saved our lives!" "How did you know that was going to happen?" Perla sat up slowly, checking herself for serious injuries and finding none. The teenagers were all unharmed as well, just shaken and covered in limestone dust that made them look like they had been working in a flour mill. Behind them, the cave entrance was completely sealed by tons of fallen rock. The opening that had existed for thousands of years was now just another rocky slope on the hillside. If they had been inside for even another 30 seconds, they would have been trapped underground with no hope of rescue. "How did you know?" asked the girl with dark hair, who Perla now recognized as Lisa Park from the grocery store. "How did you know the cave was going to collapse?" Perla looked at the sealed entrance, then at the 5 young faces staring at her with expressions of curiosity and dawning respect. For 5 years, she had avoided talking about her past, avoided mentioning her geological expertise, avoided any situation that might remind her of the day when 4 people had died because she had failed to recognize similar warning signs. But today, her knowledge had saved lives instead of costing them. Today, the weight of her mining engineering experience had been a tool for rescue rather than a burden of guilt. Today, she had read the geological warning signs correctly and acted on them in time to prevent a tragedy. "I used to be a mining engineer," she said quietly, brushing limestone dust from her hair. "I know how to read rock formations and recognize when underground structures are becoming unstable." "You're a mining engineer?" Jake Morrison asked, his voice filled with new respect. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't the town know the cave was dangerous?" Perla considered how to answer that question without explaining the full history of her career and the disaster that had driven her away from geological work. These teenagers deserved an honest response, but they didn't need to carry the weight of her past failures. Sometimes people who have expertise in dangerous areas don't speak up when they should, she said finally. Sometimes we convince ourselves that keeping quiet is safer than risking the possibility of being wrong. But today reminded me that knowledge without action is just another form of abandonment. She helped the teenagers gather their backpacks and started walking back down the trail toward the parking area. Behind them, the sealed cave entrance looked like it had been closed for decades. Grass and small plants would grow over it eventually, hiding any evidence that 5 young people had almost died in those chambers, or that a former mining engineer had followed them into the darkness to bring them back to the light. The hike back to the trailhead was quieter than the frantic escape from the collapsing cave. The teenagers were processing what had just happened, trying to understand how close they had come to disaster and how they had been saved by someone they had never really noticed before. Perla was lost in her own thoughts, reflecting on the strange turns that life could take. This morning, she had been a bicycle mechanic with a buried past. Someone who had spent 5 years trying to forget her geological training and the responsibilities that came with it. Tonight, she would go to sleep knowing that her expertise had prevented 5 deaths instead of causing 4. Maybe her knowledge wasn't just a source of guilt and regret. Maybe it was also a responsibility that she had been wrong to abandon. When they reached the parking area, the teenagers clustered around her truck, clearly reluctant to separate and return to their normal lives. The shared experience of near death and rescue had bonded them together in a way that ordinary teenage adventures never could. "Can I ask you something?" Lisa said, as they loaded their hiking gear into Kevin's car. "Why did you come after us? You could have just called the sheriff and let them handle it." It was a good question, one that Perla had been asking herself during the walk back down the trail. Why had she risked her own safety to enter a collapsing cave system? Why had she trusted her geological judgment after years of doubting it? Why had she chosen to act instead of delegating the responsibility to others? "Because I've seen what happens when people get trapped underground," she said finally. "I've lost friends in cave-ins and mine collapses. I know what it means when geological warning signs are ignored or misunderstood. I couldn't let it happen again, not when I had the knowledge to prevent it." Did someone you knew? Jake started to ask, then stopped, realizing he might be venturing into territory that was too personal. "Yes," Perla said simply. 15 years ago, I was working as a geological engineer for a mining company. 4 of my colleagues died in a mine collapse because I missed warning signs that I should have recognized. I thought I had learned everything I needed to know about underground safety, but I was wrong. People died because I failed to properly assess the geological risks. The teenagers were quiet for a moment, absorbing this information and trying to understand what it meant. They were young enough that the idea of professional failure leading to death was still abstract to them, but old enough to recognize the weight of what she was telling them. "But today, you didn't miss the signs," Kevin said. "Today, you recognized the danger and saved all of us." Perla nodded slowly. "Today, I paid attention to what the rocks were telling me. Today, I acted on my knowledge instead of hiding from it." She exchanged contact information with all 5 teenagers and made them promise to tell their parents about what had happened. Other families needed to know that the local cave systems might be dangerous, that geological hazards could exist even in familiar recreational areas. More importantly, she wanted them to understand that expertise came with responsibilities, that knowledge of risks created an obligation to warn others, and that sometimes the most important thing you could do was trust your professional judgment, even when you weren't completely certain of the outcome. After the teenagers drove away, Perla sat in her truck for several minutes, staring up at the hillside where the cave had been. From this distance, there was no visible sign of the collapse or the dramatic rescue that had taken place. It looked like just another rocky outcropping in the natural landscape. But she knew that underneath all that newly fallen stone was a network of chambers where 5 young people had almost died, and where one middle-aged bicycle mechanic had remembered who she used to be and why her geological knowledge mattered. The drive back to town gave her time to think about what would happen next. The teenagers would tell their parents about the cave collapse, and word would spread quickly through Cedar Falls' tight-knit community. People would want to know how she had predicted the collapse, why she had gone into the cave alone, and what qualified her to assess underground geological dangers. They would learn that the quiet bicycle mechanic had a professional background she had never mentioned. They would discover that she had expertise she had never advertised. Some of them would probably start asking questions about other geological risks in the area, wanting her to survey their basements, their foundations, their property for potential hazards. The thought of returning to geological consulting work scared her, but it also felt like a natural progression. Today had reminded her that knowledge without application was just another form of hiding. She had spent 5 years trying to forget what she knew about rocks and earth and underground structural stability. Maybe it was time to remember that expertise could save lives as well as cost them. When she reached the bicycle shop, she found a small crowd waiting for her. Word had already spread through the town's network of concerned parents and curious neighbors. People wanted to thank her, to hear the story firsthand, to understand what had really happened in the cave system that no one had realized was dangerous. Perla answered their questions as honestly and thoroughly as she could. She explained the geological processes that had made the cave unstable, the warning signs that indicated imminent structural collapse, the reasons why limestone formations were particularly susceptible to sudden failure. She talked about cave safety protocols, the importance of proper geological surveys before recreational exploration, and the need for ongoing monitoring of natural underground spaces. She didn't talk about the Blackstone mine disaster or the 4 colleagues she had lost 15 years ago. Those details weren't necessary for understanding today's events, and the pain was still too raw to share with casual acquaintances. But she did mention that she had previously worked as a geological engineer, and that her professional background had helped her recognize the danger in the cave system.
As the crowd began to disperse, Mayor Morrison approached her with an expression of gratitude mixed with official concern. "I can't thank you enough for what you did today," he said, shaking her hand formally. "If something had happened to those kids, especially my nephew Jake, well, I don't want to think about it." "I'm just glad everyone made it out safely," Perla replied. "I have to ask you something," the mayor continued. "Would you consider doing geological surveys of the other cave systems and natural formations in our area? After what happened today, I'm worried that we might have other dangerous situations that we don't know about. We could hire a consulting firm from the state capital, but that would take months to arrange and cost the town a fortune. You're right here, you obviously know what you're doing, and you've already proven that you can identify these kinds of risks." The request was both tempting and terrifying. Tempting because she missed the intellectual challenge of geological analysis and the satisfaction of using her expertise to protect people. Terrifying because accepting consulting work meant taking responsibility for other people's safety based on her professional judgment, risking the possibility that she might be wrong again and that her mistakes might cost lives. "Let me think about it," she said, though part of her already knew what her answer would be. That evening, Perla sat in her apartment above the bicycle shop and stared at the geological textbooks she hadn't opened in 5 years. They were like artifacts from a previous life, reminders of who she had been before the weight of professional failure had crushed her confidence and driven her away from the career she had loved. She pulled one of the books from the shelf, a comprehensive guide to structural geology and rock mechanics that had been her constant companion during graduate school. The pages were filled with her handwritten notes from classes and fieldwork, marginalia that reflected the enthusiasm of a young engineer excited about understanding the physical processes that shaped the earth. That enthusiasm had died in the Blackstone mine, buried under tons of collapsed rock along with Tommy Rodriguez and Sarah Chen and Mike O'Sullivan and Janet Pike. For 5 years, she had believed that her passion for geological analysis had been naive and dangerous, that her confidence in reading rock formations had been misplaced arrogance that had led to tragedy. But today had taught her something different. Today had shown her that expertise abandoned was just as dangerous as expertise misapplied. By refusing to use her geological knowledge, by hiding her professional background from the community, she had been abandoning potential victims just as surely as she had failed her 4 colleagues in the mine. The teenagers in the cave could have died because she was afraid to trust her own judgment. They were alive because she had finally chosen to act on what she knew instead of hiding from what she remembered. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from her past and start using it to protect the future. Perla opened her laptop and began researching the geological formations around Cedar Falls. If she was going to accept Mayor Morrison's request to survey local cave systems and natural hazards, she needed to approach the work with the same methodical thoroughness that had made her a respected mining engineer before the Blackstone disaster. She worked late into the night, reviewing topographical maps and geological surveys, identifying potential risk areas, and planning systematic evaluation procedures. It felt strange to be thinking like an engineer again, to be analyzing rock formations and pressure systems and structural stability relationships. But it also felt right, like putting on a familiar jacket after years of wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. For the first time in 5 years, she was using her mind for something more intellectually demanding than bicycle repairs. She was applying her education and training to protect people instead of just avoiding the possibility of harming them. Her geological knowledge was like a tool that she had locked away after it had caused an accident. But tools weren't inherently good or evil. They were only as effective or dangerous as the skill and judgment of the person using them. Today had proved that she could still use her geological expertise effectively, that 15 years of experience hadn't been negated by one terrible mistake. The next morning, she called Mayor Morrison and accepted his offer to conduct geological surveys of the cave systems and other natural formations around Cedar Falls. She also contacted the State Geological Service to request updated seismic activity reports and recent survey data for the region. If she was going to return to consulting work, she was going to do it right. She would be more careful, more thorough, and more conservative in her safety recommendations than she had been during her mining days. She would never again assume that she understood all the variables in a complex geological system. Word spread quickly through Cedar Falls that Perla was officially returning to geological consulting. People who had never thought about underground risks suddenly wanted to know if their basements were structurally sound, if their wells were properly sited, if their properties were built on stable ground.
She found herself busier than she had been since leaving the mining industry. But this was different work. Instead of helping companies extract resources from the earth, she was helping families and communities understand the geological processes that affected their safety and property values. Instead of pushing the boundaries of what was structurally possible underground, she was establishing conservative safety margins that would protect recreational users and property owners. The cave surveys took several weeks to complete. Perla investigated 7 different cave systems and natural formations in the hills around Cedar Falls, using ground-penetrating radar, seismic monitoring equipment, and traditional geological assessment techniques to evaluate their structural stability. She found serious safety issues in 3 of the cave systems, moderate concerns in 2 others, and acceptable stability in the remaining formations. Her reports were detailed and comprehensive, written in language that could be understood by town officials and concerned parents rather than just other geological engineers. Each report included photographs of warning signs that hikers should watch for, maps showing safe and dangerous areas, recommendations for ongoing monitoring, and emergency contact information for cave rescue services. She made it clear that geological conditions could change over time, and that areas deemed safe today might become dangerous in the future due to seismic activity, water erosion, or other natural processes. The town council voted unanimously to implement her recommendations. Warning signs were posted at dangerous cave entrances, safety guidelines were distributed to local hiking groups, and the high school added a unit on geological hazards to their earth science curriculum. Most importantly, no one else got trapped in unstable underground formations. 3 months after the cave rescue, Perla received a letter from the State Geological Service. They had heard about her work in Cedar Falls and were impressed by the thoroughness of her reports and the clarity of her recommendations. They wanted to know if she would consider taking on a consulting contract to evaluate recreational cave systems and geological hazards throughout the region. The offer represented a full return to professional geological work, the kind of career she had abandoned after the Blackstone disaster. It meant traveling to different sites, writing technical reports, and taking responsibility for other people's safety decisions based on her professional judgment. It meant risking the possibility of being wrong again, of missing warning signs that could lead to more deaths. But it also meant using her knowledge and experience to prevent future tragedies, instead of just hiding from past failures. It meant turning her understanding of geological disasters into expertise for geological safety. After a week of consideration, Perla accepted the contract. A year later, she was working full-time as a geological safety consultant, traveling throughout the state to evaluate recreational underground sites and natural hazard areas. She had hired Tommy Rodriguez Jr. to manage the bicycle shop while she was traveling, creating a partnership that honored the memory of his father while also building something new and positive. The bicycle shop remained an important part of her life and her connection to the Cedar Falls community, but the consulting work had become her primary career focus. Her home office was filled with geological reference materials, topographical maps, and sophisticated monitoring equipment. The walls were covered with photographs of cave systems she had surveyed, along with copies of safety reports and letters of appreciation from grateful local officials. On her desk was a framed photograph of 5 teenagers standing outside a sealed cave entrance, all of them dusty and grinning with the relief of people who had just survived something they hadn't fully understood. Next to the photograph was a small piece of limestone from the cave collapse, serving as a reminder of both the dangers of geological instability and the importance of acting on professional knowledge, even when that action involved personal risk. Perla had learned to carry the weight of both her failures and her successes. The 4 friends she had lost in the Blackstone mine would always be part of her story, a reminder of what could happen when geological warning signs were missed or misinterpreted. But the 5 teenagers she had saved from the collapsing cave had taught her that expertise could be used for protection as well as extraction, that knowledge could prevent disasters as well as cause them. She was still the same person who had failed to recognize the gas pocket that caused the mine explosion 15 years ago. But she was also the person who had recognized the structural instability in the cave system and acted on that knowledge in time to prevent another tragedy. Both versions of herself were real, and both were necessary for the work she was doing now. The guilt and caution from her past failures made her more thorough and conservative in her current assessments. The confidence from her recent successes gave her the courage to trust her professional judgment and act on her geological knowledge when people's lives depended on it. The cave rescue had taught her that hiding from expertise was just another form of abandoning the people who needed it. Knowledge without application was a waste of education and experience. Expertise without responsibility was a betrayal of the trust that came with professional training. She had found a way to honor both her past and her present, to use the lessons learned from disaster to prevent future tragedies, to transform the weight of geological knowledge from a burden into a tool for protection. In the quiet town of Cedar Falls, where a former mining engineer had become a bicycle mechanic and then returned to geological consulting on her own terms, Perla had discovered that redemption was possible even after catastrophic professional failure. She had learned that expertise could be rebuilt after being shattered, that confidence could be restored after being destroyed, and that knowledge could save lives even after it had cost them. The most heroic thing she had ever done wasn't dramatic or obviously courageous. It was simply choosing to trust her professional judgment one more time, even after that judgment had failed her catastrophically in the past. It was deciding to enter a dangerous cave system because she was the only person present who could recognize the warning signs of imminent collapse. It was using 15 years of geological experience, both successful and tragic, to bring 5 young people safely back to the surface from a place where they could have been trapped forever in the darkness underground. Sometimes heroism looked like a middle-aged woman with scraped hands and torn clothes, covered in limestone dust, sitting in the sunlight outside a sealed cave entrance and explaining to 5 confused teenagers why their adventure had almost become a tragedy, and how geological knowledge could mean the difference between coming home safely and never coming home at all. And sometimes the greatest act of professional courage was simply choosing to be a geological engineer again, even after being a geological engineer had once meant failing to save the people who depended on your expertise to keep them safe in the dangerous places where their work took them underground. But the story didn't end there. Success had a way of creating new responsibilities, and Perla's growing reputation as a cave safety specialist brought challenges she hadn't anticipated. 6 months after accepting the state consulting contract, she received a phone call that would test everything she had rebuilt about her professional confidence. Dr. Elena Vasquez from the National Cave Rescue Association was calling about a situation in Colorado, a complex cave system where 2 experienced spelunkers had been missing for 36 hours. "We need someone with your specific combination of geological expertise and cave rescue experience," Dr. Vasquez explained over the phone. "The local teams are excellent, but they're dealing with a limestone formation that's showing signs of instability similar to what you documented in your Cedar Falls reports." Perla felt her stomach tighten. "I'm not a trained cave rescue specialist. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time in Cedar Falls." "Ms. Martinez, we've read your geological assessments. Your understanding of progressive collapse patterns in limestone formations is exactly what we need. The missing cavers are trapped in a section that our structural engineers can't evaluate safely. We need someone who can read the warning signs and guide the rescue team through potentially unstable areas." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Dr. Vasquez explaining the situation in technical detail. The missing cavers were experienced explorers who had been mapping an unmapped section of the Whispering Cavern system near Boulder. They had been due to exit the cave system by noon the previous day, but their emergency contact hadn't heard from them. Their cars were still in the parking area, and their planned route led through sections of the cave that showed recent geological stress. "We can't send rescue teams into those sections without understanding the collapse risk," Dr. Vasquez concluded. "Local geologists have looked at the formation, but none of them have your specific experience with cave-in patterns and progressive structural failure." Perla found herself agreeing to fly to Colorado the next morning, though every instinct told her she was getting involved in something beyond her expertise. Cave rescue was different from geological consulting. It involved immediate life-or-death decisions under extreme time pressure, with no opportunity for the careful, methodical analysis she had learned to rely on. But 2 people were trapped underground, and she was apparently the only person available who might be able to help bring them out alive. The flight to Denver gave her 6 hours to study the geological surveys and cave maps that Dr. Vasquez had emailed to her. The Whispering Cavern system was vast and complex, extending deep into the Colorado mountainside through multiple limestone formations of varying ages and stability. The section where the cavers were believed to be trapped showed clear evidence of recent seismic stress, with fracture patterns that reminded her uncomfortably of the Cedar Falls cave system just before its collapse. She arrived at the rescue site to find an organized chaos of professional emergency responders. The Cave Rescue Association had established a command post near the cave entrance, complete with communication equipment, medical facilities, and staging areas for rescue teams. Local sheriff's deputies were managing traffic, and keeping curious onlookers at a safe distance. Dr. Vasquez met her at the parking area, a small, intense woman in her 50s with the kind of calm competence that came from years of managing emergency situations. She led Perla to a table covered with cave maps, geological surveys, and structural analysis reports. "Here's what we know, Doctor," Vasquez began, pointing to a detailed map of the cave system. "Jake Peterson and Maria Santos entered the cave at 8 a.m. yesterday morning. They're both experienced cavers with proper equipment and emergency supplies. Their planned route would take them through the main passage to this junction point, then north through the unmapped section they wanted to explore." She traced the route with her finger, showing how the passage descended through increasingly unstable rock formations. They were due to exit by noon, with a hard deadline of 4 p.m. for emergency contact. When they didn't show up, we sent a preliminary search team into the main passage. The team found evidence that Peterson and Santos had reached this point around noon yesterday, but there's no sign of them beyond that. "What kind of evidence?" Perla asked. "Food wrapper, water bottle, and a chalk mark on the wall indicating their planned direction. Standard cave exploration practices. But the passage they entered shows recent geological stress that our initial search team wasn't comfortable navigating." Dr. Vasquez led Perla to the cave entrance, where she could see the stress fractures and warning signs that had made the rescue teams cautious. The limestone formation was more complex than anything she had encountered in Cedar Falls, with multiple layers of rock that had been shaped by different geological processes over millions of years. "The main concern is here, Doctor," Vasquez continued, pointing to a section of the cave ceiling where hairline cracks formed a spider web pattern across the rock surface. "Our structural engineer thinks this area could be on the verge of collapse, but he's not sure how much weight it can support, or how vibrations from rescue activity might affect its stability." Perla studied the fracture patterns with growing unease. They were similar to the warning signs she had learned to recognize during her mining days, but the limestone formation was more complex than the relatively simple structures she had worked with in underground mining operations. "Have you tried to establish communication with the missing cavers?" she asked. "We've been calling down the passages every hour, but there's no response. Either they can't hear us, they can't respond, or—" Dr. Vasquez didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Perla spent the next 2 hours studying the cave system and consulting with the rescue team leaders. The plan they developed was necessarily cautious. A small team would enter the cave system and advance as far as safely possible, with Perla providing real-time geological assessment of each section they encountered. The rescue team consisted of 4 people: herself, Dr. Vasquez, and 2 experienced cave rescue specialists named Marcus Chen and Rebecca Walsh. They were all equipped with helmets, headlamps, rope systems, and communication equipment that would allow them to stay in contact with the command post on the surface. "Remember," Dr. Vasquez said as they prepared to enter the cave, "our primary objective is to locate Peterson and Santos if they're still alive. But we don't take risks that might create additional casualties. If the geological conditions become too unstable, we retreat and consider other options." Perla nodded, though she wasn't sure what other options might exist if the direct rescue approach proved impossible. They entered the cave system at 2 p.m., moving slowly through passages that Perla evaluated step by step for structural integrity. The main tunnel was relatively stable, with solid limestone walls and ceiling that showed no immediate signs of collapse risk. But as they progressed deeper into the mountain, she began to notice the subtle warning signs that indicated increasing geological stress. "Stop here," she said, when they reached the junction point where the missing cavers had been last seen. "I need to examine this section more carefully." She studied the rock formations around the junction, using her headlamp to illuminate fracture patterns and stress indicators that might not be visible to rescue specialists without geological training. What she saw made her increasingly worried about the stability of the passages ahead. "The rock formation changes here," she explained to the team. "We're moving from older, more stable limestone into a newer formation that's been subject to more recent geological stress. The fracture patterns indicate that this area has experienced significant pressure changes in the past few months." "Is it safe to proceed?" Rebecca Walsh asked. Perla hesitated. The honest answer was that she didn't know. The geological indicators suggested increased risk, but not immediate danger. The passages might be stable enough to support a small rescue team, or they might collapse at the slightest disturbance. Her geological expertise could identify the warning signs, but it couldn't predict the exact timing of potential failures. "We can proceed, but we need to be extremely careful about noise and vibrations," she said finally. "Stay close together, move slowly, and be prepared to retreat quickly if I see any changes in the rock formation." They advanced into the northern passage that Peterson and Santos had entered, with Perla constantly monitoring the ceiling and walls for signs of increasing instability. The passage was beautiful in the harsh light of their headlamps, flowstone formations and mineral deposits created by thousands of years of water erosion and chemical processes. But beauty couldn't disguise the geological reality that they were moving through an increasingly unstable environment. After 20 minutes of careful progress, they heard something that stopped them all in their tracks. A faint tapping sound echoing from somewhere ahead in the darkness. "That's a distress signal," Marcus Chen said quietly. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, standard caving emergency protocol. The sound was coming from a passage that angled downward to their left, deeper into the mountain and further from the exit routes they had been following. Perla examined the entrance to the passage and felt her heart sink. The geological stress indicators here were worse than anything they had encountered so far. "This section is extremely unstable," she reported to Dr. Vasquez over the radio. "The fracture patterns suggest that the ceiling could collapse with very little provocation. I'm not sure it's safe to enter this area. But that's where the tapping is coming from," Rebecca Walsh pointed out. "If Peterson and Santos are down there, this might be our only chance to reach them." Perla found herself facing the same kind of decision that had haunted her since the Blackstone mine disaster. She could recommend against entering the unstable passage, potentially condemning 2 people to death underground. Or she could approve a rescue attempt that might result in additional casualties if her geological assessment was wrong. The tapping sound continued, faint but persistent, a human signal from somewhere in the darkness ahead. "I need to go down there and evaluate the geological conditions firsthand," she said finally. "But only one person should go initially. If the passage is stable enough for one person, we can consider sending the full rescue team." "That should be me," Marcus Chen said. "I'm the lightest team member and I have the most cave rescue experience." But Perla shook her head. "I'm the only one who can read the geological warning signs in real time. If the passage starts to become unstable while someone is inside, I'm the only one who might recognize the danger in time to get them out." Dr. Vasquez's voice crackled over the radio from the surface. "Perla, you're not trained for technical cave rescue. Your job is geological assessment, not direct rescue operations." "The geological assessment requires me to be in the passage," Perla replied. "I can't evaluate structural integrity from a distance, not in a formation this complex and unstable." The debate continued for several minutes, but ultimately the logic of her position prevailed. She was the geological expert, and accurate assessment of the unstable passage required direct examination. The rescue team would remain at the junction point, ready to provide assistance or retreat if necessary. Perla entered the downward passage alone, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that every step might trigger a collapse. Her headlamp revealed a narrow tunnel that curved through the limestone formation like a wormhole, with walls and ceiling that showed clear evidence of recent geological stress. The tapping sound was louder now, definitely coming from somewhere ahead. But as she advanced through the passage, she could see that the geological conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Loose rocks littered the floor, indicating recent minor collapses. The ceiling was scored with fractures that seemed to grow wider as she watched. The limestone formation here was actively failing, held together more by habit than by structural integrity. After 50 feet of careful progress, she rounded a curve in the passage and saw light ahead. Not sunlight, but the artificial illumination of Caver's headlamps. She called out softly, not wanting to create vibrations that might trigger a collapse. "Peterson? Santos? This is a rescue team. Can you hear me?" "Here," came the reply, weak but clearly human. "We're trapped under a rockfall. Maria's injured." Perla advanced until she could see the situation clearly. The passage opened into a small chamber where a partial ceiling collapse had occurred, probably within the past day. Jake Peterson was sitting against the far wall, conscious and apparently uninjured. Maria Santos was lying beside him, awake but clearly in pain, with a makeshift splint on her left leg. Between Perla and the trapped cavers was a pile of fallen rock that partially blocked the chamber. The rocks could probably be moved with careful effort, but the ceiling above the pile looked like it was ready to complete its collapse at any moment. "How bad is Maria's injury?" Perla called out, still not entering the unstable chamber. "Broken leg, maybe some internal injuries," Peterson replied. "She can't walk, and I can't carry her through the rockfall without help." Perla studied the geological situation with growing alarm. The chamber ceiling was a spiderweb of fractures that intersected at multiple stress points. Any significant vibration or additional weight might bring down several tons of limestone. But without entering the chamber and moving the fallen rocks, there was no way to extract the injured cavers. She radioed the situation back to Dr. Vasquez and the rest of the rescue team, describing both the medical emergency and the geological hazards they were facing. "Can you stabilize the ceiling long enough for us to get them out?" Dr. Vasquez asked. Perla looked up at the fractured limestone above her head. In a mining operation, she would have recommended immediate evacuation and professional structural reinforcement before attempting any rescue. But this wasn't a mining operation, and there wasn't time for professional structural work. "I don't know," she said honestly. "The ceiling could hold for hours, or it could come down in the next few minutes. There's no way to predict the timing of the final collapse." "What do you recommend?" It was the same question she had been asked 15 years ago at Blackstone Mine, and she had given the wrong answer then. 4 people had died because she had been too confident in her geological assessment, too willing to approve operations in areas that she should have known were dangerous. But today, giving the conservative answer might mean condemning 2 people to death underground. Peterson and Santos couldn't survive indefinitely in the collapsed chamber, and Maria's injuries might worsen without immediate medical attention. "We attempt the rescue," she said finally. "But we do it fast, and we do it carefully. Get the full team down here with rope systems and medical equipment. We go in, stabilize Maria for transport, clear enough rocks to create an exit route, and get everyone out before the ceiling comes down." "Are you sure about the geological assessment?" Dr. Vasquez pressed. Perla looked up at the fractured ceiling one more time. "No, I'm not sure. But I'm sure that Peterson and Santos will die if we don't try. And I think there's a reasonable chance the ceiling will hold long enough for us to get them out." It was the most honest professional assessment she had ever given, acknowledging both the risks and the uncertainties while still providing the guidance that the rescue team needed to make their decision. The full rescue operation took 45 minutes from start to finish. The team moved rocks, splinted Maria's injuries more thoroughly, and rigged rope systems that would allow them to evacuate both cavers safely. Throughout the operation, Perla monitored the ceiling for signs of imminent collapse, ready to call for immediate evacuation if the geological conditions deteriorated. The ceiling held. They extracted Peterson and Santos from the chamber, guided them through the unstable passages, and brought them safely to the surface where medical teams were waiting. Maria was transported to a hospital for treatment of her leg fracture and minor internal injuries. Peterson was exhausted, but unharmed. The chamber ceiling collapsed 6 hours after the rescue, sealing that section of the cave system permanently. If they had waited for more equipment or more conservative safety measures, Peterson and Santos would have died underground. But they had also been incredibly lucky. The geological assessment that had guided the rescue operation had been educated guesswork rather than scientific certainty. Perla had been right about the timing of the collapse, but she could just as easily have been wrong. The successful rescue made national news and established Perla's reputation as one of the country's leading experts in geological cave rescue operations. Requests for her consultation services came in from emergency response agencies across the United States and Canada. She found herself traveling constantly, evaluating dangerous underground situations and training rescue teams in geological hazard assessment. The work was professionally satisfying, but emotionally exhausting. Each rescue operation carried the potential for tragedy, and Perla found herself carrying the weight of decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for people she had never met before. 2 years after the Colorado rescue, she was called to Tennessee to assist with a mine collapse that had trapped 12 workers underground. The situation was similar to the Blackstone disaster, but this time she was on the rescue side rather than the operational side. Her job was to evaluate the stability of rescue tunnels and guide extraction operations through potentially dangerous geological formations. The Tennessee rescue lasted 4 days and ultimately saved 8 of the 12 trapped miners. 4 workers died before rescue teams could reach them, not because of geological mistakes, but because of the inherent dangers of underground emergencies. But Perla found herself reliving the Blackstone disaster through every hour of the Tennessee operation, remembering what it felt like to be responsible for geological decisions that cost lives. The successful aspects of the Tennessee rescue didn't erase the emotional impact of losing 4 more people underground. Perla returned to Cedar Falls emotionally drained and questioning whether she was strong enough to continue doing geological rescue work. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the trauma counselor she had been working with since returning to geological consulting, helped her process the complex emotions surrounding the Tennessee operation. "You saved 8 people who would have died without your expertise," Dr. Martinez reminded her during their session. "The 4 who didn't make it weren't lost because of anything you did wrong. They were lost because underground emergencies are inherently dangerous, and not everyone can be saved." "But how do I know when I'm making the right decisions?" Perla asked. "How do I know when I'm being appropriately cautious versus when I'm being paralyzed by fear of making another mistake?" "You don't know," Dr. Martinez replied. "That's the reality of working in high-stakes professional situations. You make the best decisions you can with the information available, and you accept that uncertainty is part of the responsibility you've chosen to carry." The conversation helped Perla understand that perfectionism was incompatible with emergency rescue work. She couldn't save everyone, and she couldn't make decisions with complete certainty about their outcomes. What she could do was apply her geological expertise conscientiously and accept the emotional weight that came with that responsibility. She continued her consulting work, but she also made changes to maintain her emotional health. She limited herself to no more than 6 major rescue operations per year. focusing the rest of her time on preventive safety consulting that was less emotionally intense. She maintained her primary residence in Cedar Falls, where the bicycle shop provided a connection to simple, predictable work that didn't involve life or death decisions. Tommy Rodriguez Jr. had expanded the bicycle shop's mission to include outdoor safety education, offering classes in hiking safety, wilderness first aid, and geological hazard recognition. Perla taught monthly seminars on cave safety and geological awareness for local hiking groups and school classes. The educational work was deeply satisfying because it represented the preventive side of safety, teaching people to recognize and avoid geological hazards before they became emergency situations. Every person who learned to identify unstable rock formations was someone who might avoid getting trapped underground in the future. 5 years after the Colorado rescue, Perla received a letter that reminded her why her work mattered. It was from Jake Peterson, one of the cavers she had helped rescue from the Whispering Caverns system. "Dear Ms. Martinez," the letter began, "I wanted you to know that Maria and I got married last year, and we're expecting our first child in the spring. We never would have had the chance for this happiness if you hadn't been willing to enter that unstable passage to find us. Your courage gave us the rest of our lives." The letter was a reminder that geological rescue work wasn't just about technical expertise or professional competence. It was about giving people the chance to continue their lives, to build families, to pursue dreams that would have been impossible if they had died underground. Perla kept the letter on her desk next to the photograph of the 5 Cedar Falls teenagers and the piece of limestone from the collapsed cave. They were reminders of why she had chosen to trust her geological expertise again, why she had decided to use her knowledge to protect people instead of just avoiding the possibility of professional failure. The work wasn't easy, and the responsibility wasn't light. There were still nights when she woke up thinking about the Blackstone mine disaster, still moments when she questioned whether she was qualified to make decisions that affected other people's lives. But there were also moments when she knew with absolute certainty that her geological expertise was a tool for protection rather than just a source of professional anxiety. In her apartment above the bicycle shop in Cedar Falls, surrounded by geological reports and cave rescue equipment and photographs of people she had helped bring safely back to the surface, Perla had found a way to live with both the weight of her past failures and the responsibility of her current successes. She was still the geological engineer who had missed the warning signs that cost 4 lives at Blackstone Mine. But she was also the geological engineer who had recognized the warning signs that saved 5 teenagers from a collapsing cave, who had guided rescue teams through dangerous underground passages, who had taught hundreds of people to recognize and avoid geological hazards. Both aspects of her professional identity were real and necessary. The failures made her more careful and conservative in her assessments. The successes gave her the confidence to act on her expertise when people's lives depended on it. The measure of a professional life wasn't whether you never made mistakes, but whether you learned from your mistakes in ways that helped other people avoid similar dangers. Perla had found a way to transform her geological knowledge from a source of guilt and regret into a tool for protection and rescue. And in the quiet moments between emergency calls, when she was adjusting a bicycle brake or teaching a hiking safety class or reviewing geological surveys in her home office, she understood that redemption wasn't a destination you reached, but a process you lived, one careful decision at a time, one life saved at a time, one student taught to recognize danger before it became tragedy. The work continued, and so did she, carrying both her expertise and her humanity into the dangerous places where geological knowledge could mean the difference between people coming home safely or never coming home at all. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.